Well, I'm starting off. Welcome everyone to the APWWmeet Series 2020. This is a series of webinars and conversations that will take place at the Asia Pacific level over the next few months in the lead up to the CSW and Generation Equality. This event is being recorded. This webinar will be available on the APWW website. Today's webinar is in honor of the 10th anniversary of UN Women. Our speakers will discuss working for the creation of UN Women, the Gender Equality Architecture Reform, or the GEAR campaign. And I am Sepali Kotegoda, and I will be moderating today. Each speaker will have 7 to 8 minutes with questions and answers at the end of all speakers. So our speakers today are Patricia Likwanen. She chaired the UN Commission on the Status of Women during the preparations for the UN 4th World Conference on Women in Beijing, China. She chaired the main committee that was the Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action. Next, we have Bandana Rana. She is the Vice Chair of the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW. She served as the Executive President for SATI, a women's NGO network, a women's NGO working on violence against women and children in Nepal. Third, we have Noeline Hazer. She's the Vice Chair of the, we have Noeline Hazer. She served as Under Secretary General of the United Nations and Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, ESCAP. Prior to this, Noeline headed the United Nations Development Fund for Women, UNIFEM, for 13 years. And last but not least, we have Lopa Banerjee, who is the Director of the Civil Society Division at UN Women. She is based in New York and leads UN Women's work on supporting and strengthening women's rights groups and civil society movements. So let me first invite Patricia Likwanen to kick off this session. Thank you.
My GEAR story begins in 2005. The year was Beijing plus 10 years after the United Nations 4th World Conference on Women held in Beijing, China in 1995. And 10 years of the implementation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the most progressive and comprehensive global blueprint for women's rights and empowerment. The UN CSW at its 49th session reviewed the implementation of the platform. Noting the disappointing progress, it concluded that this was due largely to the fact that national mechanisms for the advancement of women were hampered by their low position in government hierarchies. It was further noted that institutional mechanisms for gender equality of the UN were similarly situated. NGOs expressed concern about the gender architecture of the United Nations, composed of small, under-resourced agencies. These were the Division for the Advancement of Women, the International Research and Training Institute for the Advancement of Women. Yes, thank you. The Office of the Special Advisor on Gender Issues and the Advancement of Women, and the United Nations Development Fund for Women, or UNIFEM. There was growing realization, we can remove the slide now. There was growing realization that 10 years after Beijing, normative frameworks for gender equality and women's human rights had advanced. We had the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and we had the Beijing Platform for Action. However, lack of implementation and accountability undermined commitments. And gender mainstreaming was not working or was limited in implementation. Another major event of 2005 was the World Summit. This was a follow-up to the UN Millennium Summit. In the dialogue with civil society in the lead up to the summit, again, the women NGOs raised their concern about the UN gender architecture. The World Summit requested the Secretary General to establish a high-level panel on system-wide coherence to explore how to strengthen or more tightly manage the UN's work in development, humanitarian assistance, and the environment. In February 2006, Secretary General Kofi Annan established a high-level panel on UN system-wide coherence. So GEAR got organized. The Gender Equality Architecture Reform, or GEAR campaign, was a global initiative of women's NGOs proposing the creation of a stronger UN entity for women. Our motto, let's gear up. The GEAR global focal points were, and can we have the next slide, Women's Environment and Development Organization, the Center for Women's Global Leadership, the Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, or DAWN, the Association of Women's Rights in Development, and the International Planned Parenthood Federation. We agreed on the GEAR principles and recommendations. The entity should, 1, be headed by an Undersecretary General, 2, have strong normative or policy mandate, and extensive programmatic or field presence, have substantial and predictable resources. We proposed 500 million to 1 billion US dollars. 4, promote gender mainstreaming throughout the UN. And 5, have accountability at national and international levels with meaningful involvement of civil society and NGOs. The first phase of the campaign was to lobby the high-level panel. So we sent statements, we dialogued with individual members, we attended meetings, we attended consultations. I remember specifically the regional consultation for Asia held in Islamabad in May 2006, and the global consultations with civil society organizations in Geneva in July 2006. On November of that year, the panel submitted its report titled Delivering as One to Secretary General Kofi Annan, who then presented it with his strong endorsement to the 61st session of the General Assembly. So the ball was in the GA's court, and GEAR began its lobby of the General Assembly, which held meetings in the year 2007 and 2008. The GEAR campaign at national, regional, and international levels was intense, passionate, and tenacious. Let me share one GEAR-related event close to my heart. In all the discussions, the recommendation that the new entity be ambitiously funded was clearly the most difficult. At the Asia-Pacific NGO Forum on Beijing +15, held in Quezon City, Philippines in October 2009, the participants delivered a strong message by making individual donations to support the new entity. From the pictures, you can see how the excitement and support for the new UN entity for women was palpable. Finally, on July 2nd, 2010, the General Assembly adopted the resolution creating the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women, to be known as UN Women, by consolidating and transferring the existing mandates and functions of OSAGI, DO, INSTRO, and UNIFEM. And as they say, the rest is history. But why are we talking about the GEAR campaign today? Why? Because we were there in the room where it happened, and there is much to learn from the GEAR experience. First lesson, change can happen even in the UN. Second lesson, genuine change happens with the action of multiple players, and NGOs are vital players. In the Philippines, we have a favorite rice cake called bibingka. The bibingka is cooked by putting the container with the cake batter on a clay stove filled with hot coal. Then a pan with more hot coal is put on top. The Philippine women's movement refers to the bibingka principle in our work. The need for fire on top, in this case, the World Summit, the Secretary General, the high-level panel, UN agencies, and the need for fire below, involved and organized women's NGOs. Let me end with two messages. To UN Women, NGOs were an important part of your creation and continue to be essential partners in your work. To NGOs, we have a lot at stake in UN Women. We must continue to be invested in it, in her, and support her sustainability and effectiveness. Happy 10th anniversary, UN Women.
Thank you very much, Patricia. May I now ask Vandana to continue our story?
Thank you, Sefali. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I would like to thank APWW for organizing this very critical webinar and giving me the opportunity to reflect on my and our collective engagement and advocacy to the creation of this very important and powerful entity. I endorse everything that Patricia has said. She has given the global historical background as well for the need of the campaign and what our demands were. So I think I will personally share some personal stories from a perspective of a South Asian campaign. I recall it was 2006 April. I was then the chair of the National Women's Commission of Nepal when we got information that there is this UN reform process going on, and this is an opportunity for us to campaign and raise our voice for a
Yeah, Vandana's picture has stalled. I think it may be due to the connection.
NGO heads who had outreach throughout the country. So we needed to get that constituency and understanding and strength and voice of the constituency. So we started mobilizing this constituency. And then we realized that we need to go beyond Nepal. You know, it cannot be, our voices would not be heard unless it's a collective campaign. So with the stalwarts of South Asia, some of you were part of it also, as well as Asia Pacific, we formed a campaign institution called South Asian Campaign for Gender Equality. It was SACGE, with stalwarts. Some of the photos I have seen, Patricia, that you have shared with Pam Rajput, Savitri Gunashekharam, from Pakistan, Mahmouda Islam. So these were all stalwarts who started mobilizing constituencies from throughout South Asia and formed this network. I must say that, civil society alone would not have got all that information. So this is a very critical partnership of those who were inside the UNIFEM. Particularly, I would like to mention, because Nolene was there at the top as the executive director of UNIFEM, and in the South Asia region, it was Chandni Joshi who was leading the South Asia regional office. So without their information, without the knowledge that they shared with the civil society, we would not have been able to take this forward. And I just would like to share some reflections. I recall we met a few of us from South Asia, went on a delegation to meet one of the coherence panel chairs, which was the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Shaukat Aziz. And we handed him this memorandum of the demands that Patricia has already mentioned. And he was positive, he listened to us, but one of the challenges he threw at us was, you are a handful of South Asian activists. How can I believe that this is the voice of the constituency that you represent? give me that leverage, and then I will share it with everyone. So I recall that challenge very well. So we came back and then we geared up in the sense that in 2 months' time, we collected from South Asia, all the stalwarts of South Asia got into action, and we collected 1 million signatures. Technology was not as such as it is today. So we had thick couriers of books couriered to the 3 coherence panel chairs through their missions. I still have copies of those. And that was one thing that I recall very much. The second thing I recall was after some months, there was an international conference in Pakistan, where I was also invited. And the Pakistani Prime Minister, way far, we cannot reach out. He had his written speech. And I was hoping he would mention this campaign of the women. But he did not. He finished it. It was a written speech. He finished. But he folded his paper. He looked up. And then he talked about this, whole of Asia and the globally, women are now writing to me. And this is a campaign that we need to. And I tell you, that was so overwhelming, for a head of state coherence panel chair to speak like that in an international conference. So I think these are benefits, benefits of the campaign, working together collectively. And then, of course, during the launch of the UN Women in February 2011, I was very proud and gratified to represent the GEAR campaign in the launch, speaking at the General Assembly Hall with the strength of the GEAR members that were there. And I think this is an experience where I feel that, local matters. You need to take the voice of the local and then connect to the global. So it was so gratifying to connect to the GEAR campaign with the global leaders like Charlotte, June, Bani. It was so very connecting. And of course, we Asia Pacific were one. So I think it is what learnings that I get from this is, this has been a very critical experience for me. In my 30 years of my experience, I feel that has given me hopes that it is so important to work together, to work collectively. And if we are persistent, if we work collectively, if we have clear goals, and we have that partnership with other stakeholders within the UN as well, we can make things happen. As Patricia said, change can happen. So this is the lesson that I have learned. That gives me the hope. Even when I serve in the CSW committee now, this is the hope, the strength of the civil society, the strength of the feminists that work within the UN organizations, and the strength of other member states who can take this forward. So I think amplifying the voice, working together collectively, critical partnership, and taking the local to the global, that needs to, and bringing the global again to the local. That is extremely important. I will end here. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Bandana. May I just say that if participants have any questions, please type those into the chat box. And at the end of the panelist presentations, we will try to address some of the questions. So now, may I invite Noeline?
First of all, it's so heartwarming to hear the stories and the history from Patricia as well as from Bandana. And I'm so happy to see so many of the UNIFEM players as part of the participants, from Chani Joshi to Socorro Rias. Let me say that we are having this conversation at a time of multiple crises. The social, economic, and health impact of COVID-19 are unprecedented and have magnified the inequalities worldwide. And as we reimagine our world anew and prepare for the great reset that is needed in COVID-19 era, it helps to draw a few lessons from the past. And the energy and the hope and the mobilization that you've heard is so critical at this particular time. So let me share 2 lessons during my time as the Executive Director of UNIFEM, and why my team and I eventually had to initiate the move to create what is today UN Women. So the first lesson that I would like to share is to understand the nature of the United Nations. You have heard the mobilization from the ground, but it is important to understand the nature of the United Nations. It is a hierarchical, intergovernmental organization where governments make decisions that affect the direction and functioning of the organization. At the same time, the leadership of UN organizations can use the values and principles of the UN Charter to open up spaces and build alliances with we, the peoples, to begin and bring about social change and accountability. And the UN has had a strong history of mobilization and partnership with civil society. And I was very fortunate to be a part of one pivotal moment in this history. Now, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the UN used the moral authority of its charter, which is so important today at its 75th anniversary, to mobilize the collective power of nations and civil society to pursue a more inclusive global order for the 21st century. And this was done, as you've heard, through a series of UN conferences, beginning with the World Summit on Children, to the Meeting on Human Rights, to Population and Development, to the Summit on Social Development, and of course, to the Fourth World Conference on Women. And tens of thousands of women, especially from civil society, participated actively in the UN conferences, mobilizing to establish new norms and agendas and to reimagine the world anew through women's eyes. I was deeply involved with the Asia Pacific NGO preparation for the Fourth World Conference on Women before becoming the ED of UNIFEM. Hence, central to my leadership and that of my UNIFEM team in all our work was the importance of what I call the inside-outside partnership, mobilizing the power of constituencies and knowing how to use top-down and bottom-up leadership to change the rules of the game when they do not work for women, so that we can move towards a more inclusive and sustainable, peaceful future for all. So my second lesson is learning to navigate the circumstances of the moment and the disruption that can be caused by even one powerful member state using the power of money. And this is such an important message at this particular time. By 2005, 2006, I had served as UNIFEM's executive director for almost 13 years, transforming it as a small entity to a powerhouse, leading women's empowerment and gender equality in the UN development system. So my team and I grew UNIFEM's annual resources from US 9 million to about 150 million, invested in women's economic security and rights, ending violence against women, women's political empowerment, women, peace and security, and a presence from about 20 to 80 countries. Now, despite all our successes and strength, the organization was once again threatened of being integrated into UNDP. Now, under the 2005-2006 UN Reform Initiative, there were already discussions of merging the larger entities like UNFPA and UNICEF with UNDP to form a consolidated UN development entity. There was very strong resistance from the powerful heads of these entities. Tensions were extremely high and the merger efforts had stalled. The then Minister for Development Cooperation of the Netherlands, Agnes van Aarden, became impatient and ordered a suspension of some budget allocation and the use of the power of money to allocation to the UNDP core resources unless it could show its strength by integrating smaller organizations it had some top-down power over. And she suggested UNIFEM because we were the women's organization for women's empowerment and gender equality. And these issues, according to her, should be mainstreamed throughout UNDP. Now, throughout my meeting with her, she went ahead with her recommendation, despite all my objections and putting the issues in front of her. And it made it extremely difficult for both UNIFEM and UNDP. Joanne Sandler, my deputy, was one of the first to observe way back in 2004, 2005, that the gender architecture of the UN system, broken by turf wars, needed a large-scale overhaul. We decided at that time then to use the UN reform of 2006 to initiate this and to stop UNIFEM's integration into UNDP. The seeds of what became UN Women, the merger of the 4 UN entities for gender equality, including UNIFEM, was sown. Now, these 4 separate entities had different mandates, including work on gender equality and women's empowerment. UNIFEM was by far the largest of the 4, with extensive programs and ground presence. And several supporters advised me to take the path of UNFPA and be fully independent, as it was historically also administered by UNDP. This was in fact one of the recommendations made by the study we commissioned under the auspices of the UNIFEM Consultative Committee, chaired from 2004 to 2007 by Prince Zed, who was at that time the ambassador of Jordan to the UN. The study recommended 3 other scenarios for the gender architecture. Follow the route of UNAIDS, become an entity like the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, or merge the existing gender entities. Of course, our preference was to have a fully independent UNIFEM. However, I knew that this possibility could not succeed given the pressures of the UN reform, the turf wars among the fragmented gender entities, the ambition of UNFPA to expand their gender mandate, and the changes in the political environment of donor countries. There was no appetite among member states to support the creation of a separate UN organization without some kind of merger. After intense discussion within UNIFEM, we agreed that consolidation was a shorter route to a more powerful UN institution for women's empowerment. My staff began mobilizing our civil society constituency to support this, aware that this entity will be building on the strong foundations of UNIFEM. So along with civil society groups and the GEAR campaign, as you have heard from Patricia and Vandana, we seized the opportunity of the UN reform agenda to push for the UN Under-Secretary General post for the Join Up UN Organization for Women's Rights that would bring both the normative and the operational mandates of the 4 organizations to create what is now UN Women. While there was support from several member states for this idea, resistance was very strong from the gender entities and from UNDP. They saw this as UNIFEM's initiative and an ambitious takeover. This fight was now left to Deputy Joanne Sandler and my team, as I was appointed as Under-Secretary General and the first woman to head the Economic and Social Commission for Asia Pacific. As an Under-Secretary General of the UN, my work was so much easier and institutionally supported compared to my time at UNIFEM, where my team and I had to fight to create the space to do our work. Today, UN Women is regarded as a poster child of the 2006 UN reform agenda, with a seat at the highest level of UN decision-making and the ending of turf wars among the gender entities. But I want to say that without the support, and I would like to actually end by honoring all my UNIFEM staff and our civil society partners, because without their support, this initiative would not have taken off. And it is indeed the best example of inside, outside, top-down, bottom-up partnership. Thank you and congratulations to all. Keep up that fighting spirit and keep the fire burning.
Thank you very much, Noeline. So let me now ask our last speaker, Lopa Banerjee, to give your presentation.
Thank you so much, Sepali. And thank you very much to APWW for organizing this, what do I say, inspiring, storytelling, history making, recalling history, and celebrating history. You know, the women's movement talks always about storytelling as a way of making change. And what we have heard just now is the story of, as speakers have repeatedly said, inside-outside work. And in fact, this inside-outside work started not just with the GEAR campaign, actually started way back in 1995 with the Beijing conference itself, and in the manner in which civil society outside worked with feminist bureaucrats inside the UN to adopt the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, and in a sense paved the way for the establishment of all of that which led to the GEAR campaign and ultimately to the formation of UN Women. So I just want to start first by really honoring all the speakers on this call, but all of the participants that I see actually online joining this, and indeed all of those who have been part of this history, who continue to be part of the present, and who will be part of the journey going forward. So, so salutations to all of the activists out there in the world as UN Women celebrates its 10th anniversary. And I want to say very much that the GEAR campaign actually established the blueprint for the manner in which UN Women would work with civil society. That inside-outside modality of civil society together with member states working to establish standards for gender equality, which is actually what UN Women was. It was a standard-setting moment for gender equality, the formation of UN Women. And it worked with civil society on the outside, member states on the inside, working together to establish this entity. And that modality has continued. UN Women is unique within the UN system for the depth and the significance and the centering of its relationship with civil society. UN Women is an organization that works on enabling, helping, supporting member states to set the standards and to implement standards for gender equality. But the inspiration for those standards comes from civil society. So UN Women's work is you know, not just incomplete, it is an existential issue for UN Women. Its partnership with civil society defines UN Women's mandate in significant ways. And that was really put into place by the manner in which the GEAR campaign led the formation of UN Women together with member states. So, and that model is something that UN Women has continued. If, you know, in its early days, starting with UN Women was very nascent at that stage, the Rio +20 conference. Early days when UN Women began to work with civil society and states towards the Rio +20 outcome. But the first big moment for UN Women working in this manner with civil society and member states, it was still a very new agency, it was actually CSW 57. Those many on this call will remember that. It was the big CSW. It was new. It was in 2013. UN was only, you know, it had been established in 2011. It had started operations in 2011. It was only the second. So 2011, 2012, it was only the sort of the third of UN Women as UN Women CSWs. And it was, if you will recall, the priority theme was ending violence against women and girls, which the previous time that CSW had discussed it, which was 10 years ago, there had been no agreed conclusions. And in 2012, for the CSW on rural women, there had been no agreed conclusions. Therefore, for CSW 57, which was on ending violence, and ending violence in a sense was also was a centerpiece of work for UN Women at that time, and subsequently, of course. So this CSW was, in a sense, if you will, the coming of age of UN Women. And that modality of establishing these partnerships with civil society at the global level, at the regional level, at the national level, to work together on the agreed conclusions, on the negotiations, from the outside, because civil society, as you know, does not participate in CSW negotiations, but to create the lobby and advocacy platforms that UN Women did with civil society so as to reach the agreed conclusions of CSW 57, which, if you will recall, was truly a standard. It was on the wire. All of you will remember, it took place. The UN was under, it was going through renovations, and so the CSW was taking place in the annex building in the North Lawn, and civil society was camped outside the negotiating rooms, and people were going back and forth, UN Women, member states, back and forth between civil society and inside. Language that was being helped to prepare for delegations who were negotiating, and that modality stayed. And then the next big moment was the adoption of Goal 5 in the SDGs. Such a difference, the adoption of the SDGs from the Millennium Development Goals. It's a manner in which that whole intergovernmental process unfolded. The Millennium Development Goals was a member state enterprise. The Sustainable Development Goals were a multi-stakeholder, civil society-led enterprise, civil society-centered, not led, civil society-centered. And for UN Women, its lobbying and its work on Goal 5, on establishing Goal 5, wouldn't have taken place without its institutional partnerships with civil society. And that, in a sense, has continued, and if you will, through a history after that of intergovernmental spaces, whether on humanitarian, whether on women, peace and security, whether on the global migration issues, whether on the urban agenda, across these big intergovernmental moments, the financing for development, the institutional partnerships with civil society have been at the core of UN Women pushing the normative and the standard setting agenda, constantly in partnerships with civil society. And those alliances have helped. And in a sense, the Beijing +25 is actually a culmination of that. The Generation Equality Forum is a culmination of that inside outside, because the Generation Equality Forum actually establishes civil society in equal partnership with member states and the UN system and other stakeholders. And that's the big shift also, because within the intergovernmental space, civil society works from the outside. So within the intergovernmental space, it's the inside outside. But within the Generation Equality Forum, which is about strengthening the multilateral system, which is about strengthening the gender equality agenda and galvanizing the gender equality agenda by center staging civil society at the core, together with the intersectionality, the diversity of the women's movement as it currently is, and the center staging of youth activism, feminist youth activism as it currently is. And the shift is that it is a modality of partnership and alliance building where it is equal partners. And it's not an easy thing. Nobody knows how to be an equal. Civil society, member states, and the UN do not know how to be equal partners. The hierarchies remain. You know, member states are hierarchical, civil society is in combative mode. The UN is in this thing of trying to, negotiate. So it's a whole new way of learning to partner as equal partners with the Generation Equality Forum. And the legacy of that is establishing this new modality of partnership within the multilateral system so as to strengthen the multilateral system. Because the multilateral system, which birthed UN Women 10 years ago, today faces a set of challenges. In fact, many of us within the multilateral system, and certainly civil society, say that if UN Women was to be born today, it would not be born. The challenges within the multilateral system today from within the system itself are so severe. The pushback on gender equality within the system, within the multilateral spaces, and is so strong. So this modality of partnership where we continue to strengthen this inside outside, but actually bring it into a space where it becomes equal partnership going forward. And this has assumed even more criticality today. Because, you know, over the years, all of us have been saying, even for Beijing 25, the Beijing 25 review said, progress has been slow, sluggish. Gender equality, we are not moving at the pace that we want to. When Generation Equality Forum was set up last year prior to COVID, it was about accelerating change, galvanizing change, because progress has been sluggish. But today, post-COVID, we are no longer talking about sluggish progress. We are actually talking about regression. So today, what COVID has led to is all of the inequalities that persisted have been so magnified that we actually stand at a moment of deep and profound regression. In 5 months, we have seen a 30% increase in gender-based violence, reported. We're not even talking about unreported. 30% increase, triple, a 3 times increase in gender-based violence in only 5 months since COVID happened. Now, this is not just about the perpetrators in homes who are perpetrating violence. This is about also the collapse of services and systems which had prevented violence. So the 30% increase is not just because the act of committing violence, but also the erosion, the rapid erosion of the response to violence. That's why you've got a 30% increase in 5 months. So we are, and around care work, as it is, women were doing 3 times the amount of care work, and the magnitude of what has happened with care work. Women who are frontline health workers, who are 70% of the informal workforce, and added to that, the care work that has increased. So we are seeing, and around all of this, women are in the front line. They are the majority of health workers. They are in the front line of the COVID response. Civil society is in the front line of the COVID response. Civil society organizations have diverted resources into becoming, service providers. They have had to move away from their advocacy work, many of them, yet they are without resources. They are being shut down. They are closing down because of lack of resources. Shrinking space has been magnified because of some of the responses to COVID around lack of assembly, around sort of, restrictions around assembly and so on. So we are at a moment where the dangers of regression are huge, and therefore the need for the radical and urgent action that comes from this mobilizing and the women's movement that mobilizes around this, and the working together of intergovernmental organizations, of the UN, of member states, to mobilize, to harness the mobilization that already exists among civil society. As we have seen, for GEAR, it was a transnational organized movement. What we are seeing today, whether it's through Black Lives Matter and racial justice and climate justice and Me Too and youth movements all over, is an organic transnational feminist activism. And therefore, the legacy of GEAR today for UN Women and indeed the UN system is to be able to harness that mobilization so as to be able not just to build back better from COVID, but to build back differently so that you create that sustainable momentum of radical change and accountability based on that working together of state and civil society for transformative change and sustainable change and peace, ultimately peace, so that the next time a pandemic hits us, and this is not the last time that we will be hit by a pandemic, but that the next time that the pandemic hits us, we have put into place structures through this inside-outside, through this joined-up partnership, through this equal partnership that can withstand a pandemic, and we are not faced with the situation that we are with today. And that is the legacy of GEAR, and that is what goes forward, that idea of this joined-up partnership for radical, transformative, but sustainable change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lopa. We have some questions that we can take up now. One is, all right. Sakura says, may I know from Lopa the progress made in this connection? How has UN Women's transformation to UN, UNIFEM's transformation to UN Women helped in increasing its resources? We had also a question on, hold on just a minute. Jane Pritchard has asked, is data collection as strong as it was under INSTRAW? So some of these questions, I think everybody can answer, jump into the questions that are being asked, but I would suggest you take about 2 minutes maybe to try and answer this question. Yeah. And also, can you share how many countries of the world responded with a gender perspective lens to the COVID issues? From Sunita. It's addressed to Lopa, but I think all of you have experience, so please jump in. And a third one, what can we do to bridge, what can we do better to bridge the gap between global advocacy and local activism? And this is Yumi Lee. Having worked in both spheres, my observation is that women at the grassroots are not connected with what is happening globally on women's rights. So we have basically about 3 questions. Can you all please take about 2 minutes each to respond? Thank you.
Okay, so let me start off with the question on resources and then go with the specific ones, and then I'll make one comment on the global advocacy, local activism. So on resources, you know, it is 10 years ago, the GEAR campaign called for 500 million to 1 billion for UN Women. 10 years later, 2020 is the first year that UN Women reached the 500 million mark. Oh, so it's taken 10 years for this to happen. But of course, there's no guaranteeing that that's where it stays, because as we know from this COVID moment, the fact that there is already predictions of massive cutbacks in funding going forward into 2021 and forward in overall in development and certainly for UN Women as well. But that said, and I think this speaks to the issue of gender equality and the whole financing for gender equality. that our executive director, Pumzile Mlambo Nkuka, is fond of showing this diagram. If you look at, I don't have the diagram with me right now, and I wish I was able to show it to you. It shows all of the UN agencies and the resources that are given, and then there's UN Women, which is like this tiny. It's the tiniest little dot in this whole sea of the UN system, where in terms of the resources that it gets from assessed contributions. But that said, that the challenge is really to match commitment with financing. And that continues to, it is the existential challenge of UN Women, is that the gender equality agenda remains woefully underfunded. And that takes you to COVID as well, to Sunita's question. I think it was Sunita's question on COVID. At this point in time, the interesting thing about COVID is that the last time that there was a financial crisis, countries moved into austerity mode. With COVID, it's been about stimulus. At least at this point in time, it's been about stimulus, although ILO and others are saying that it will move into austerity hereafter. But at this point in time, it's stimulus. Right now, if you look at stimulus packages that countries have put together, it's all countries together, $16 trillion in stimulus packages. And including from many countries in the global south, 10% of their GDP has gone into stimulus packages. And yet, if you look at how much of that is going to gender equality issues, woefully less. So the calls for the most visible aspects of COVID, which is gender-based violence, which is unpaid care work, which is the lack of representation of women at the table to help shape the COVID response, the stimulus packages. In all of these resources are not being pushed into it. And this continues to be the call in terms of ensuring that this money is going so that a COVID response is about building back better and differently with gender equality achieved. It is an opportunity. It hasn't as yet been fulfilled. And this is why this brings me to the point about global advocacy and local activism, because this is not about global advocacy. This has to be about local activism. Because the COVID response is in countries. And so the activism at the country level, together we're joined up with the global system so as to be able to push the IFIs, to push the global architecture, financial architecture on COVID, but driven from the country level, because that's where the stimulus is taking place.
Nolene?
Sorry,
Yes.
everyone. Sepali seems to have dropped out. Does anyone else have an answer to this?
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes. All right. Yes. So should I come in, or should Patricia? Would you like to take this on first? Huh? Would you? After you.
No, you go ahead, Nolene.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So first of all, it is very good news to hear that UN Women has actually reached 500 million this year, because if you join the resources from UNIFEM and DOR, because DOR had about 30 million when we were joined, so together we had about 180 million before the start of UN Women. So this is more or less doubled. So that is very good news. The importance of data is extremely important, and we must not forget the role that INSTRAW has played in terms of the data collection from a gender perspective, as well as the type of research. And I hope that UN Women will focus very much on this, but of course working throughout the whole UN system, because there is data set as well as the statistics department that is so wonderfully important, especially now with the use of the big data and the artificial intelligence. Data is being collected everywhere, but we have to make sure that the algorithms and so on actually is gender sensitive. And this is so critical, or else it will actually strengthen the deeper and deepen the discrimination against women. Now, in terms of the COVID-19 response from a gender lens, this is so critical. As we have heard from Lopa, there is $16 trillion that is used for the stimulus packages. We have to make sure that this actually goes to fund the sustainable development goals, as well as all the different platforms that came out of the different UN conferences, especially on the Fourth World Conference on Women, and to focus things from a gender lens in terms of health security, in terms of livelihoods, in terms of education, because you can imagine what is happening to our generation, to youth, because the unemployment rate among youth is so huge. The amount of people dropping into poverty is now estimated as 100 million in terms of the extreme poor. If we are not careful, our children will be called the COVID-19 generation, and they will be struggling to actually balance life and livelihoods. And we should not forget the most vulnerable people in our midst, which is actually the low-wage migrants, the undocumented migrants, the refugees, because unfortunately today in our world, we don't know how to stop the wars, and we still have an economic system that is so dependent on low wages, especially in terms of women, and also highly dependent on the informal sector and women as care workers. Now, in terms of the global advocacy and the local women's movement, globally, we have to realize that the multilateral system has been weakened by big power, rivalry, and competition. And I don't have to say any more about that. I think we are all aware. Now, at the same time,
can I just ask you quickly to wrap up?
Yeah, all right. Yeah, all right. So what we need at the global level is actually a global alliance. It's the rethinking of what new multilateralism needs to actually look like. And we cannot now have that divide of the global and the local. We need to have a bottom-up multilateralism that starts from the local, so that the real issues facing people's lives get incorporated into the much larger global agenda. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Vandana? Tati?
I'll go after Tati. Yeah.
Well, basically, I think we can't avoid talking about COVID. And here, again, the lessons we learned from the GEAR campaign might be helpful. Certainly, at this point, there has to be a combination of fire from the top and fire below. And I would like to make the pitch that essentially this hit us at the time we were observing or celebrating Beijing plus 25. And in a sense, I would really like that we can combine our observation of Beijing plus 25 with our response to COVID. Because essentially what we were trying to do is look to see how far we have come in implementing the Beijing Platform for Action, and what inequalities still exist that have to be, so to accelerate the implementation of the platform. So I believe that essentially what is happening with COVID is that, as I think we have said in other fora, what the inequalities that still exist 25 years after Beijing are exacerbated by COVID, and hopefully this won't happen totally, but the gains we have made since Beijing are now in danger of being lost. And so it is here that I believe our advocacy, our fire from the top and fire from the bottom has to apply itself to building this new normal for women and for the world. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I will not touch on the other aspects of COVID that the other panelists have done so, but I would like to add my bit on the local activism and global advocacy and how we bridge that gap. And I think for that, though the challenges today is extremely much more than what it was then, as has been already mentioned, but I think the GEAR campaign is a perfect example about how the local voices matter and how collectively, I would like to stress again on the inside-outside partnership. That is so important. And of course, as advocates for gender equality, we look at UN Women as a nearest and closest ally within the UN to bridge this gap. And I think GEAR is a perfect example. I just want to give 2 or 3 practical examples. Like, for example, I mean, COVID has also opened us and showed us new opportunities in terms of mobilizing through the social media, discussions through the social media, you know, like the webinars and all this was not, we had never thought of it. Now it's possible. So I think that kind of connection, because that was not there when GEAR campaign was there. So this is a powerfully potential medium that we can still connect with the global and the local. I think this is one area. The other, which UN Women has been doing and needs to accelerate further, is having civil society representation in intergovernmental negotiations. I think that is extremely important because that is where the local voice can get integrated into global policies. So that's another thing that I would stress on. And the other last thing is, I know UN Women has civil society advisory groups. I myself served in the Global Civil Society Advisory Group. And this advisory group should be the voices of the communities, the voices of the local voices that can actually express the concerns to UN Women and through UN Women to influence global policies. So I think the key is partnership, the inside-outside partnership that Nolene and all the speakers talked about. That is extremely important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Remember, this is the beginning of a series of ongoing discussions. And today we have received some really important questions that can lead to a full discussion. But I'm sorry, we can't address all the questions today. But I would like to thank you all for participating. And we welcome you to contact us through the APWW website. Thank you to the speakers, APWW, and Women and Have Wings, whose funding has supported this APWWmeet 2020. And I would also like to add my thanks to Carol Shaw and Luz Martinez, who have done the background work for this webinar today. Please do look for the next webinar that we will be organizing in a few weeks' time. So thank you all and goodbye.